Welcome everybody for this exciting day. My name is Charlotte Bigg and I will be moderating panel 3, which is dedicated to the Lantern on Tour, and we ourselves will be taken on a very wide tour to the UK, to Central Europe and to Spain. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker. John Plunkett is Associate Professor in the Department of English at the University of Exeter, and among his many publications and books we can name Queen Victoria, First Media Monarch, and Victorian Print Media, a Reader with Andrew King, as well as popular exhibitions, Science and Showmanship, 1820 to 1914, edited with Joe Kember and Jill Sullivan. John.
Thank you. My paper is on Benjamin Molden, a figure who was regarded as the most successful touring lantern lecturer in the UK in the 19th century, and was arguably Britain's most prestigious lecturer for a period of around a decade from the 1870s onwards. I'm going to set out some key features of his career and the characteristics that distinguished his lantern lectures. In particular, I want to argue that Molden's success was enabled by the increasing commercial and institutional organisation of public lecturing in the second half of the 19th century. Molden's career is at the forefront of both the professionalisation of public lecturing and the lantern trade. When he retired in December 1899, after a career of over 30 years, the Optical Magic Lantern Journal noted that he had probably made more money by his lantern lectures than any other lecturer. And here he is lecturing on the Egyptian War at the Royal Victoria Coffee Hall in Lambeth in 1882. Again, same venue in 1889, just to give you a little flavour. By 1893, he had reputedly given 600 lectures at the Royal Polytechnic and another 3,000 on the road. And at that point, he still had another 6 years of touring left. Molden's career encapsulates how far the lantern trade had come from the itinerant and seasonal Galanti showman. Now, the broader research questions I'm interested in, and which I hope we can discuss more in this panel, include how did one get to be a touring lantern lecturer? What were the different networks and exhibition circuits that they used? What, if anything, distinguished a professional lecturer from amateur presenters? Were there national differences in the infrastructures and logistics that enabled touring lecturers? And I think Martin's paper on Australia was a really good example of that yesterday, talking about pepper. For Molden, his emergence was a case of being in the right place at the right time, in that the demand for touring lecturers was really taking off at the same time as other forms of touring scientific spectacle, such as the astronomical lecture or experimental demonstration, were in decline. Whereas gentlemen amateurs, such as a local vicar, teacher, optician, or scientific enthusiast, might turn their hand to giving occasional lantern lectures, this only ever constituted part of their civic, educational, or professional work. In contrast, a specialised and professional lantern lecturer was able to take full advantage of the instrument's potential for wonder, spectacle, and communicative effect. Molden's lecturing performance, his speaking style, was equally as important, though. He was kind of renowned for his easy on-the-ear delivery. He provided respectable, engaging, and improving fare in a more digestible way than the overly dry, useful knowledge lectures that were associated with the early years of the Mechanics' Institutes in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. In some ways, Molden was a bridge between the take-up of the lantern by popular science in the 1830s and 40s and the late century upsurge when the lantern became a staple of public and educational lecturing. So Molden, he's born in 1838. He's initially apprenticed as a wood engraver in London, and adverts by him asking for engraving work can be found in prominent journals such as a publisher's circular as early as 1859. He's only 21 at this point. And this one is from 1862. And his engraving training would obviously have given him kind of a really good basis in pictorial composition that he could take into his subsequent lantern work. And it's also telling that this advertisement is in a trade journal, the Publishers Circular, which aimed at networking different parts of the publishing trade. So from the very beginning of his career, Molden persistently and innovatively uses advertising to create professional opportunities. In this advertisement from the Athenaeum from 1862, it's also notable that he specifically addresses publishers of books on kind of general science, and chemistry because of his expertise in that area. A couple of years previously, so this is 1857, he's only 19 at this point, Molden was one of the successful candidates for examinations in chemistry for the Royal Society of Arts. But what's interesting is that he did so after attending classes at the Royal Polytechnic, an institution at which he would later become a lecturer for. So it's really the Royal Institution almost in some ways producing its own at this point. The origins of Molden's career speak of a convergence between popular science and art that provides both a technical and an aesthetic springboard for his lantern lectures. Joe Kember and myself have discovered new evidence that Molden began his lecturing career around the mid-1860s. Initially seems to have started in and around London. These are all kind of reports from the Islington Gazette. And these events are important because Molden's reputation is often linked to his subsequent position as a lecturer for the Royal Polytechnic in the early 1870s. Yet it was not the Polytechnic that really kick-started his career, but rather his ability to reach the ever-growing tapestry of civic, religious, and educational groups and institutions across the country, such as mechanics institutes, YMCAs, Sunday schools, etc., all of whom were looking to bring in touring lecturers to enliven their programmes. One interesting question is, how did Molden and other touring lantern lecturers get their engagements? Evidence suggests that, as in his engraving days, Molden relied not simply on word of mouth or positive reviews, but rather he used trade and specialist publications to create recognition, to create celebrity, if you might say, and to broker relationships between himself and the numerous institutions and groups seeking lecturers. Or as we might say, he hustled, and he was a good hustler. Molden was able to take advantage of the fact that the lecturing business was starting to consolidate and institutionalise itself through its own trade journal, and that's the kind of Institute and Lecturers Gazette, which I've given you a couple of images from here. This is launched in 1861, just at the right time. So published monthly, it was explicitly kind of intended to connect up the growing number of wannabe lecturers with the country's many and diverse lecturing institutes. The one on the kind of your left there is the first advertisement that we have found for Molden in this journal. It's from the 1st of October, 1866, just at the very beginning of his career, when he is soliciting business for lantern lectures on the Overland Mail, Wonders of the World, and a trip to Egypt and Palestine. By 1868, he is regularly taking out full-page advertisements and will continue to do so for the next 20 years or so. He would also continue to remain heavily involved with the journal's sister organisation, the Lecturers' Association, which was set up in 1868 as a kind of emergent union or guild for lecturers. Molden was completely plugged into the new infrastructure that came with the professionalisation of both lecturing and the lantern trade. Molden also sought bookings by advertising in other journals. You've got this one in the Christian Times in 1867, aimed explicitly at Sunday schools and day schools, complete with kind of many testimonials. So when the Royal Polytechnic came to set up a travelling branch in 1872, it was perhaps unsurprising that Molden became its principal lecturer. But Malden was already an established figure. His appointment was the Metropolitan Polytechnic, using its reputation to diversify, expand, and take advantages of the increasing opportunities for provincial lecturing. Even after ceasing his formal connection and the final closure of the Polytechnic in 1881, Malden's advertisements and programmes continued to play upon the long association. His lectures could fill the most distinguished city venues, and his staple market was the provincial societies devoted to popular education. So this is a typical example from 1876. He's at the very large Colston Hall in Bristol. It's a prime pre-Christmas slot, 22nd, 23rd of December, and he's lecturing on Arctic expeditions. Like many other of Malden's lectures, it's advertised as a dioramic entertainment, linking it with the grand scale of the panorama and diorama. Certainly the pricing structure is similar to other large format entertainments at Colston Hall, with seats in the hall at 1 shilling, while the gallery is 6p. Malden is advertised as a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and of the Royal Polytechnic, credentials which offered a guarantee of both the excellence of his lantern presentation and its educational value. Malden was regularly celebrated as a technical innovator in lantern journals and manuals. He designed his own triennial lantern in the early 1870s and was particularly praised for an improved gas tap that better regulated the flow between two lanterns, leading to more accomplished dissolving view effects. Edmund Wilkie, himself a former lantern lecturer at the Polytechnic, declared, "To this gentleman, the lantern world is indebted for many of the improvements and innovations which have raised first-class dioramic lectures to their present high position." In the 1880s and 1890s, the lanterns marketed with his name included the Malden Triopticon, the Malden Triple Lantern, and the Malden Biennial. So Malden is becoming kind of a brand, a mark of quality and precision. For his audiences, Malden's proficiency would have registered in the scale and adeptness of his projections, working in perfect combination with his spoken lecture. Between 1874 and 1887, Malden was regularly accompanied by C.W. Locke, whose fame as a lantern operator rivaled Malden's own reputation as a lecturer. And he would go on to have his own subsequent kind of significant kind of manufacturing career. You can just see an example here. And he references Malden there. In optical projection, Lewis Wright praises the fine dioramic effects aimed at by the few exhibitors who have a reputation for their exhibitions, as well as for what, apart from this, may be most excellent lectures. I mean such exhibitions, for instance, as those by Mr. Malden. Such a description is revealing. Malden's projections lifted his visits above the run-of-the-mill lecture. They were exhibitions and not simply lectures. Newspaper advertisements similarly made much of his specialised apparatus. At least initially, his triennial lantern would have been a rarity for many audiences. When he visits Weston-super-Mare in 1874, the advertisement proclaims the triple lantern to be, that's the one at the top, the most powerful and perfect apparatus of the kind in Europe. Lecturing in Plymouth in the same year, it was said to be the first time this new triple lantern apparatus had been exhibited in this locale. Aided by his triennial lantern, Malden is able to enliven his presentation with affecting transformations and stunning effects. These are often compared favourably to the painted panorama. So the Cheltenham Mercury, for example, proclaims, "The wonderful effect produced by the aid of a powerful lantern beat a canvas picture completely," while the Gloucestershire Echo praises Malden as a gentleman thoroughly conversant with his subject and uninterrupted by those horrible concert hall songs that make the painted panorama so objectionable. And this comment probably says a lot about the style of Malden's lectures. So they're informative but not dry, unstuffy and easy on the ear, more restrained, more respectable than the variety turns of the panorama. His humorous, frequently satirical observations conveyed a lightness of tone that perhaps drew upon or kind of, were influenced by earlier kind of platform luminaries such as Albert Smith. Repeatedly, the quality of Molden's descriptions, alongside that of the material on the screen, was picked out by the press. In this review of an 1886 Malden show on Burma, the kind of, typifies the appreciation customarily shown for both lecture and slides. So it says, throughout the lecture, Mr. Malden chained the interest of his audience by graphic description of the places visited, many of which he himself had seen. He frequently showed some touches of humour, but his local allusions were in nearly every case couched in a satirical vein. So like many other lecturers, his descriptions and anecdotes were enlivened by his own first-hand travels. Thus, when he lectured on America and the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia for the 1876-77 season, it was based on a recent visit and the photographs he had taken while in the US. Other slides were reproduced from the illustrated press, transferring the latest news and drama from the small page to the big screen. When Malden lectures on Stanley in his search for Livingstone in September 1872, he includes 40 slides with the permission of an illustrated newspaper, The Graphic, which had published a series of engravings based on the sketches of Henry Morton Stanley only the previous month. So just taking the Southwest as a kind of micro study, and this is the area that Joe Kember and myself have been mapping in terms of lantern lectures. We see his visits to this area exemplify the creation of himself as a well-known, distinguished lecturer. He visits over several decades, and for some institutions, his lecture was an annual fixture. So his first lecture in the region is at Devonport's Mechanic Institute, that's there, in 1870 on the new overland route to India, complete with 100 slides, many more than most such presentations. He returned again in 1871 to Plymouth with views of Turkey and Greece and of the Franco-Prussian War, before concluding with a comic tale with magic effects. So just thinking about the structure of this lecture, you've got a travelogue, you've got added elements of topicality, comedy, plus dazzling special effects. And this structure is, was very much oft repeated, with Malden usually closing with a series of virtuoso, entertaining slides, which were updated every season to keep the novel. And this practice perhaps continues the tradition of earlier lecturers, finishing with a demonstration of chromatropes or dissolving views. And it also pays lip service to the desire of such institutions to try and attract families or younger audiences to their events. This is Weston-super-Mare, 1878. A lecture on the Paris Exposition finishes with a children's treat of a variety of clever changing scenes and polytechnic effects. So chromatropes, illuminated moving fountains, dioramic statuary, and the marvellous astrometeoroscope were all common sign-offs. By August 1877, he's lectured 26 times at Plymouth, 15 times at Devonport. The previous season, he's fulfilled 160 engagements across the nation. So the stamina is just truly impressive. He continues to lecture successfully throughout the 1880s. Into the 1890s, though, he's operating in a much more crowded field. His technical mastery no longer carries quite the same impact as the lantern is becoming much more widely used. He also faces the dwindling of time-worn venues, the growth of celebrity lecturers, and the take-up of the lantern of formal educational courses such as university extension lectures. So this is his very last lecture in the Southwest. It's 1891 at Bristol on Stanley's discoveries in darkest Africa. Admission is only a penny, but it's still attracting rave reviews and probably an audience of around 500. To conclude, Malden would retire in 1900. His decades-long endeavour to use the lantern to structure his lecturing had helped pave the way for it to become a standard accompaniment as the lecturing industry evolved. His career exemplifies how a national touring lantern circuit in the UK emerged piecemeal out of hundreds of local lectures. It also shows how a series of infrastructures emerged to help organise and enable lecturing across the nation, including trade periodicals, advertising, a lecturers' association, railway networks, local societies, and the diversification of existing London institutions like the Polytechnic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for this incredibly detailed and vivid description of Molden's work. We now move over to Continental Europe, and Ludwig Vogl-Bienek and Yvonne Zimmermann will now take us to the Habsburg Empire, Prussia, and many other places. Ludwig was a senior researcher at the Media Studies Department at the University of Trier, the University of Marburg, and he's published widely on the art of projection in the 19th century, but he's also had a lot of activity in developing, for instance, the platform E-Laterna, Historical Art of Projection, and he is a founding member of the Illuminago project, which has been performing magic lantern shows since 1986. Yvonne is a professor of media studies at the Philipps University of Marburg, and she's also published widely on the topic of useful cinema. She's published, for instance, as a co-author of Advertising and the Transformation of Screen Cultures, and is the co-editor of Films That Work Harder, The Global Circulations of Industrial Cinema. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to your talk.
So in the following, we approach the great shows of Paul and Minna Hoffmann from the perspective of our research project, Performative Configurations of the Art of Projection for the Popular Transfer of Knowledge, which was funded by the German Research Foundation 2019-2021, and which dedicated one of altogether 3 case studies to Paul Hoffmann's touring lantern lectures. Paul and Minna Hoffmann's shows provide insights into the use of the magic lantern and the screen in large halls and theaters in the mid and late 19th century. In 1857, Paul Hoffmann became an early adopter of the contemporary medium of the art of projection in the emerging trade of people's education. From 1869 to 1888, his second wife, Minna, acted as lecturer in many of the performances. Their shows for that entertaining transfer of knowledge took them to numerous cities throughout the Habsburg Empire, Prussia, as well as Bavaria, and probably beyond. In October 1911, the feuilleton of the Znaimer Wochenblatt recalled Paul Hoffmann in the following words, quote, "Dante's journey through hell has never before made a deeper impression on us students than when Hoffmann recited it, performing his great dissolving views." Karl Pesendorfer, the author of the article in the Znaimer Wochenblatt, had experienced Hoffmann's great shows with dissolving views decades earlier in Vienna. He had ample opportunity to do so, as Hoffmann often performed for several weeks at various theaters in the Austrian capital between the 1950s and 1980s. One of his main Vienna venues was the Theater in der Josefstadt. To illustrate the performative configurations of Paul Hoffmann's great shows, a wood engraving from the 1989 catalogue of the New York media company McAllister can be used as a proxy. The performative configurations include the live presentations of the staged shows, consisting of an orchestration of oral comments of the lecturer, projected images, and potential sounds and music. The performative configurations also include the perceptions, reactions, and behavior of the audience. Taken together, the performative configurations characterize Hoffmann's shows as live performances. If we follow theater and performance scholar Erika Fischer-Lichte's understanding of live performances as the bodily co-presence of two groups of people who interact as performers and spectators. To describe Hoffmann's medium today, we use the terms lantern, magic lantern, or auto projection. However, Hoffmann himself never used these terms. Instead, he referred to his lectures as Grosse Vorstellungen, great shows. With this, he stuck to a term that was familiar to the public from theatrical shows in large venues and from the circus. And it was a term that emphasized the performance character of his slide shows and promised an entertaining event. Hoffmann called the images projected onto a screen at the full height of the stage prachtvolle Tableau, like magnificent tableau. For dissolving views, he used both this English term and the German metaphor Nebelbilder, like fog images. As a trademark, he established his own name in association with the titles of his great shows. To emphasize the quality of the presentations, he used the technical term of the strongest hydro-oxygenic gas apparatus and highlighted the high-quality sources on which his lectures were based. It is not known whether Hoffmann occasionally operated his projection apparatus himself during the show, nor is it known how many operators worked for him. It is certain, however, that he presented his lectures himself until 1868. From then on, he frequently ceded this role to his second wife, Minna. Besides Paul, she was the only person named on posters and handbills since then, in her role as reciter. The spoken word of the lecturer and the image on screen were the main components, whereas accompanying music played only a marginal role in the performative configurations of Hoffmann's great shows.
The first evidence of a series of events with Nebelbilder and an accompanying lecture by Paul Hoffmann is from Graz in 1857. The events took place in the hall of the Villa Schlosserer, which was mainly used for concerts and balls. Daily advertisement from the 8th to the 23rd of August announced geological shows, formation of the Earth's surface from the very beginning to the appearance of the human race. They were signed by P. Hoffmann, owner of the Astronomical Geographical Cabinet. A small vignette showing volcanoes and primordial animals gave a visual impression. At this time, Hoffmann was already active as a people's educator. In 1854, at the age of 24, Hoffmann offered public presentations of a tellurium that he described as an astronomical machine to demonstrate the natural course of the sun, moon, and earth. The one-hour events took place several times a day. Hoffmann referred to the dispositif of these presentations as cabinet. He traveled with it to many cities in Prussia and the Habsburg Empire until 1858. For illustration purposes, we use an illustration of similar demonstrations by Lipp. The astronomical demonstrations paved the way for Paul Hoffmann to become a successful traveling lecturer. As a medium, however, they confined him to dealing with astronomical topics, and the objects could only be viewed by a limited number of spectators at the same time. To further develop his activity as a traveling lecturer, Hoffmann needed a more universal demonstration medium, which the art of projection undoubtedly was. The projection of images allowed a free choice of subjects to deal with, as long as they could be illustrated pictorially. Projections the size of a theater stage could be attended by many hundreds of spectators at once. For them, the colorful depictions, spectacular dissolving views, and visual effects were as instructive as they were entertaining. To allow for the change in dispositif from the astronomical cabinet to the theatrical great shows, Hoffmann needed access to venues with several hundred seats. Suitable theaters or appropriately sized halls were part of a given cultural infrastructure in the cities where Hoffmann was active. He had to obtain access from private owners, theater directors, or public authorities. His enormous geographical radius of activity, which would previously have been very difficult, if not impossible, was considerably facilitated by the modern transport infrastructure of the railway. With the change of his basic performance dispositif, Hoffmann can be seen as an early adopter of an already existing and fast developing medium. In expanding his wide-ranging repertoire, Hoffmann actualized the technical and aesthetic potentials of the medium of the art of projection by individually designing performative configurations of the popular transfer of knowledge. In 1858, he, for the first time, included a great astronomical show in his repertoire. In the following years, Hoffmann continually revised and expanded his great shows on astronomy and geology. Hoffmann's great shows included other sections in addition to the program items given in the titles. These included spectacular dissolving views, attractive landscapes and architectural representations. As a media attraction, Hoffmann presented photographic lantern slides. In the following years, Hoffmann continuously expanded the themes of his great shows to include voyages of discovery such as the North Pole expeditions in the years 1845 to 1855, or Journey into the interior of Africa. Art historians Detlev Hoffmann and Almut Juncker have shown that Hoffmann's great shows on topics from natural sciences and cultural and geographical studies can be traced back to publications by Otto Sparmer's publishing house in Leipzig. Sparmer published an illustrated family and people's library entitled Picturesque Hours of Recreation, Malerische Feierstunden, that had the purpose of disseminating useful knowledge, Illustrierte Familien- und Volksbibliothek zur Verbreitung nützlicher Kenntnisse. While many of Hoffmann's motifs were based on illustrations in Sparmer's Familien- and Volksbibliothek, those in Sparmer's publications were partly based on widely available illustrations, such as Josef Kuwasek's illustrations in botanist and paleontologist Franz Ungerer's book entitled The Primeval World in its Various Periods of Formation, die Urwelt in ihren verschiedenen Bildungsperioden. Hoffmann introduced a series of 3 literary programs in 1868 with Dante's Divine Comedy. It was at the performances of the Divine Comedy that Minna Hoffmann gave her first lecture, and it is quite possible that she was also involved in the adaptation of the text. Gustave Doré's illustrations of Dante's Hell served as a model for all the lantern tableaux in these programs. When they included Purgatory and the entry into paradise, they had to do the slides à la Doré, because Doré did later publish his engravings on these 2 parts of the Divine Comedy. In 1871 followed Homer's Odyssey. With Die Nibelungen aus dem Bayreuther Festspiel, Hoffmann made an internationally highly acclaimed cultural event visible to his audience. At the first Bayreuth Festival in August 1876, Richard Wagner presented the entire opera cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen. Hoffmann obviously reacted very quickly, and according to his own account, presented his great show in September, October, and November of the same year in Breslau, Wrocław today. It contained all 4 operas, Rheingold, Walküre, Siegfried and Götterdämmerung, presented, as he says, in the most splendidly artistically executed tableau. Hoffmann used photographs based on the scenic designs by Joseph Hoffmann as a model for the 44 tableau. The painter Joseph Hoffmann, there was no relationship to Paul Hoffmann, had been commissioned by Richard Wagner to produce these scenic sketches. Photographic reproductions of the sketches made by the well-known Viennese photographer Victor Angerer were offered for sale in a splendidly bound portfolio from 1876. The last known performance of a great show by Paul and Minna Hoffmann was announced for the 11th November 1887 at the Hôtel de Bruce in Katowice. Paul Hoffmann died 3 months later on 15th February 1888. As soon as the 6th of March 1888, Minna Hoffmann offered Professor Paul Hoffmann's scientific performances, which were most famous at home and abroad, for sale in the Neue Freie Presse in Vienna.
So what remains are memories, like the ones by Karl Pesendorfer from 1911 quoted before. From the eyewitness point of view, Pesendorfer's memory illustrates the continuity and change in the professional activities of traveling lecturers in people's education in the last decades of the 19th century. The marriage of the spoken word with projections on a screen, as emphasized by Pesendorfer, stands for the characteristic type of live performances of the hybrid medium of the art of projection on which Paul Hoffmann based the success of his company. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ludwig and Yvonne, for this wonderful presentation. Hang on to your questions. We'll have one other talk and then we can discuss all of this with the authors. I am delighted to introduce Daniel Pitarch Fernández. Daniel is a lecturer at the University of Girona and in the degree of Art and Design at the Escola Massana in Barcelona. He's a specialist of interwar film theory, but he's also written about early cinema and experimental animation. And he is a member of artistic collective Estampa, a group that works on experimental audiovisual projects and is developing interesting work on artificial intelligence and contemporary visual culture. And Daniel will be talking to us about Míster Laschott and other touring specialists in Spain. Daniel.
Many thanks. I will divide my presentation in 3 parts. First, I would like to start with some broad reflections about the research. It is a work in progress, and I'm going to present some first results. So, sorry. You are switching it. Okay. I have a PDF, and they have to switch the projection. Sorry. But anyway, maybe I can explain a bit. When it's working, we will catch with the slides. It is a work in progress, as I was saying, and I'm going to present some further results. So any suggestions or informations are more than welcome. My research object are theatrical shows with magic lantern performances touring Spain between 1845 and 1855 as a way to contribute to with this concrete case to the history of the magic lantern as a theatrical performance. I would like to avoid, or at least acknowledge, some gaps in the study of this subject in Spain. Some are chronological, as in broad histories where we jump decades from one example to another. And other are geographical, geographical, as usually histories are written from a local perspective. And I had there 3 excellent books on optical media in Spain that were focused on concrete cities. So I want to add to this work, sorry, this different point of view, intercity point of view. And there is a third kind of gap that I don't avoid, but I want to be aware of. That is the fact that technique-centered approaches, as the one I'm presenting, can obscure the broad context of optical media, where lantern shows are in continuity with many other shows. My sources are mainly newspapers' digital collections, so it is very important what kind of terminology I use in my searches. As also it's very important to be conscious of the blind spots in the collections. For instance, I could not find newspapers from the Basque country or from Galicia. And this leads me to the last proposition there, that is to assume that the data found can be understood as being representative of normal practices and not extraordinary ones. Now I will enter the research, presenting a panorama of these lantern performances in Spain and trying to start to understand it as a system. The amount of news compiled could be, but it is just an estimation, of around 1,000. And this can help us to answer questions such as where, when, how frequent, etc., and also explain concrete practices, as inside this data there are, for example, 39 detailed programs. Regarding touring shows, sorry for that. I'm sure you can imagine the shape of Spain over you. Okay. So regarding touring shows, this is the first show I identified. Of course, for a tour, it's quite disappointing, but please stay with me, because the newspaper says that Robin will go to Madrid after Barcelona, and he is also important because Barcelona newspapers will make reference to him when reviewing future shows, signaling him as the first performer of dissolving views in this city. Klischnik is the second name, and that, yes, is more a proper tour. Klischnik was a circus performer of acrobatics and mimicry, but from 1845 to 1847, he also does lantern performances in his shows. This is something important, and was also the case with Robin. The lantern is not their identity, but just one of their numbers. Klischnik is also interesting because the programs of his, well, sorry for, okay, dissolving views. Okay. Klischnik is also interesting because the programs of his lantern shows are very similar to a previous show exhibited in Madrid in 1842 with the title of Diaphanorama. This could be evidence enough to say that the set was the same. But I think this can be even more sustained, as extracting information from these 39 detailed programs leads to the assumption that usually each show had its own slides and that repetition of the exact same subject was not that common. Also, we can add to this the fact that the set of the Diaphanorama was for sale in August 1842 in Madrid, and Klischnik was performing in this city the month before. So this could be an example of a practice of acquiring sets that can have their own history in different hands. The third touring showman is Laschott, who, contrary to the previous ones, is mainly a dissolving views performer. Apparently, he did 3 tours in Spain. One from San Sebastian to Cádiz, another a year and a half later from San Sebastian to Barcelona, and a third one from Valencia to Figueres, having then covered all these different places and even 2 more cities that I have no concrete evidence of when he was there. More on him later. Gilardi is the 4th showman, and again, he only used the lantern in some shows. In fact, only in the first 2 cities, Girona and Barcelona. And the last showman I identified is Nast, that can be traced back to these cities, and that, like Laschott, was mainly a lantern performer. So this is a first map of different shows I found touring Spain during this period. There are still other names to be properly researched and maybe added, like, for instance, another Diaphanorama show, and therefore this map will have future revisions. Another way of looking at this information is to signal its chronological dimension in order to glimpse better its frequency. But that is only half of the system of theatrical lantern performances, because there were also fixed theaters, or at least temporary fixed. This is the case in Madrid and somehow in Barcelona. In Barcelona, it was not in a theater, but in an optician shop, a case very well researched by Celia Cuenca. The presence of optical media shows and attractions in Madrid was quite important. This is a book from the end of the century that remembers the mid-century period and signals all kinds of shows, including in the 40s, the Panorama and the Poliorama, that can be sustained, that were magic lantern shows thanks to newspaper sources. And in the 50s, another place with the name of Poliorama and one with the name of Cuadros Disolventes. In fact, during 4 months in 1850, a theater in Madrid was known with this name, Teatro de Cuadros Disolventes. So, the whole system of theatrical magic lantern performances in Spain include these two possibilities, touring showmen and temporary fixed theaters. And we can take a global look at it from a nationwide or from a city-centered perspective. The third and last part of my presentation is to follow briefly Mr. Laschott in his tours, highlighting some examples of the information found. His first travel was from San Sebastian to Cádiz. It is quite interesting that there are several news of his arrival to Spain. News that highlight that he has performed abroad, quoting, for instance, a review from Paris. In fact, his touring in Europe could be a research to do, as he can be found in at least Berlin, Hamburg, Brussels, and Paris. In this news, he is added to a list of other foreign showmen arriving to Spain, a fact that is attributed to the socio-political turmoil in Europe with the revolutions of 1848 and their aftermath, an event that he shows in one of the slides of his programs. It is also interesting how these news explain his show, as these tell us something about the media landscape in which he is inserted. They talk about dissolving views, explaining that they are, in fact, as they say, cuadros transparentes. Chromatropes are also highlighted, and chromatropes seem to be something very important in many shows of this period. For instance, a review of a different show explained that the chromatrope section covered 30 minutes. And also, they say that they say that this kind of show is not new, having Madrid a place devoted exclusively to this. It is interesting also that they explain some performance practices. For instance, this review seems to imply that the chromatropes, that in the programs are at the end and separated, were used over the previous slides. The next stop where he can be traced is Andalusia. I have not found him in Madrid, even if the news of his arrival to Spain say that he will be heading there. Maybe the fact that there were other shows of this kind in permanent exhibition caused him not to being able to perform there. In Cádiz, there are several informations about his whereabouts as this program. It is worth noting that he will always be called in the press the inventor of the dissolving views, something that I don't pretend to imply that he did, of course, but I want to underline that his media identity, contrary to other showmen, is totally marked by this. And there is an interesting note also indicating that the first view will fade into the second one, explaining then something about the performance, that the dissolves are between subjects and not inside them. During his stay in Cádiz, an article was published explaining what are dissolving views, signaling then its novelty. But a novelty that the article roots in a tradition of magic lantern, phantasmagoria, and also other projection devices as megascopes. And as in other articles, when they explain this novelty, sometimes they also dismiss it a bit too, using expressions like there are nothing more than the magic lantern with a modification, or in another news from Cádiz that says that his shows are nothing more than the magic lantern with French charlatanism. Then I could not find more news about him until 1.5 years later, again in San Sebastian, starting a route that ends 10 months later in Barcelona. The news of him being in San Sebastian explains that he also has a physics cabinet. This is interesting because in this and the next route, he will also perform some recreative physics shows. But when so, even if this will be the only content of the show, he will be presented as Mr. Laschott, the inventor of the dissolving views. In this route, he performs in Logroño, Zaragoza, Lleida, and lastly, Barcelona. Barcelona is a city that I have more information about, so it is interesting to note his staying there, as it can be an example of what could be also usual in other cities. There are news in the press of his arrival, days before his first show. He will then perform, doing 8 shows, and more than a week later, there are news about his departure. In the meantime, from his arrival to the first performance, there are information that raise expectations about his show. For instance, signaling the size of the pictures of about 5.5 meters wide. During his Barcelona performances, there were several reviews or articles in the press about his work. There are many interesting informations there, but I will highlight just a few. For instance, there is a narrative about the history of this kind of shows in Barcelona, tracing it back to Robin, that was there 5 years before, and even comparing some of his concrete performance practices, as they signal that in Robin's show there were transformations and movement inside the images. Again, I find interesting which other devices are quoted to explain the show. And in this case, there are not only lantern devices, but also a reference to a kind of kaleidoscope, the aphaneidoscope. And last, it's quite interesting that the reviewer that likes the show signals that the views were short in number, being only 8. A fact that seems a particularity of Laschott performances, as other shows' programs are certainly larger. The novelty of his show is displayed in another article, in a way that does not criticize it, but suggests that maybe the price is too high for a non-exclusive apparatus. And also is displayed his quality in relation to similar shows in France or England, signaling an international consciousness of the media. The last news that I find of him explains that he leaves Barcelona in order to go to London and come back again. This is interesting because in the next shows, that are only 3 months later, newspapers will say that he brings a new collection acquired in London. This could be a practice of touring showmen in order to renovate their slide arsenal. The 17 programs that I have found of him seem to sustain this, as in each travel there are some slides that are the same, each row is a slide, but there are always new ones, 13 in each travel. In his third travel, I have located him first in Valencia and last in Figueras. It is worth noting that he will perform in several cities in Catalonia and not just Barcelona, covering then quite an important part of it, a practice that maybe he also developed in other places. He will spend this time about 3 months in Barcelona, performing 2 kinds of shows, one of dissolving views and one of recreative physics, but he does not mix them, and as said, he is always referred as the inventor of the dissolving views. From Barcelona, he goes north to the border and presumably crosses to France, not to return to Spain again. But it is interesting that, as happened with Robin, he is now inserted in the history of these shows in Barcelona. And 2 years later, a review of Nast's show compared his performance, this time not only to Robin, but also to Laschott. This was a small and fast glimpse of my ongoing research. I don't have proper conclusions to end with, as I prefer to give you an overview of it in its present state. Many thanks for your attention, and again, and of course, any comments or information will be highly appreciated, as this is still in a working state. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'd like to invite our speakers to come and sit on the stage, and we can open discussion. We have a few minutes. Just to remind you that we probably have viewers far away, so if the speakers could repeat the questions so that our distant attendants can answer them.
Probably a question for all of you. Very enjoyable panel. I assume here and there, particularly in your presentation, that this is the first phase of your research. But all the papers were largely based on newspaper sources. So I was wondering, does it imply necessarily that there are no archives, or have you never begun that research yet on Hoffmann or Molden? And if so, because I'm particularly interested in manuscripts or perhaps even typescripts of lectures. You know, I realize that on the road you may change things, but because the talks were largely about the visual aspect, and I'm wondering to what extent the talks also contributed to the attractiveness of the shows.
Does anyone want to begin? Just repeat the question.
Regarding Paul Hoffmann, this was already researched by Almut Juncker and Detlef Hoffmann, and we only have the sources of them, as we quoted. And we get from some posters and handbills, we get some clues how they made their presentations, but the lectures are not existent. And there is no archive where they could be found.
Yeah, it happens.
But if I may add, with the newspapers, in the case of Paul Hoffmann, we are lucky with the German, the Austrian context, because in Austria there's the Anno, which is the Austrian newspaper online initiative. So it was, we were fortunate to do this research on a digital, in a digital manner.
It was very helpful in the times of Corona.
Yes, it is a great. So with Malden, we've got again quite an extensive record from the newspapers, and you know, you're right. The kind of the spoken word, the orality of the lecturing is really important to his appeal. I haven't found any of the actual lectures or text of the lectures yet, although kind of Richard gave me a couple of sources to follow up kind of yesterday, so I'll be kind of chasing those down.
In my case, I have to do more research to say some things like really properly, but I found more references to music than to voice. And in fact, in Laschott, when he's doing his like recreative physics show, there's a note in the newspaper saying, Monsieur Laschott or Mr. Laschott is sorry for not speaking well Spanish, but that is something that is said in his recreative physics show, and I think I don't have found this reference in his dissolving view show.
What's his nationality?
I think his nationality, Laschott is in the Magic Lantern Encyclopedia, and I want to say that because it's wonderful that we have this kind of books, and I want to say that it's great that this kind of book exists. And he seems to be from Austria.
I can tell you where he's from. He's from Graz.
Okay.
And it's an artist name.
Okay.
His real name was a different name. So it's difficult to track him, the origins.
Okay.
And he traveled after Spain, probably traveled around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Found some notes that he was in North Africa. So, and he started in Austria. Thank you.
And okay, maybe we can talk later. I found something about him in a paper about the lantern in Turkey. Is that? Well, we can talk later.
Question here.
So I have a question because if you don't have any indication that he was also doing something in Portugal, because also was crossing to Galicia, it looked like. So I don't know if you have found any indication of that.
So a question about whether Laschott also lectured in Portugal.
Yeah. I couldn't have access to newspapers in Portugal. I tried to, but I did not find collections of these particular years in my first research. But it will be, yeah, of course, that is a question that I have myself. and yeah. But he was not close to Galicia. He was just going from the Basque Country to Andalusia. Andalusia is quite close to Portugal, but Lisbon and Porto are more. Yeah, but this was another show called the Panorama that was more in Galicia. But it will be very interesting to do this international in whole peninsula tour.
Thank you. Question in the back here.
Yes, it's a question for Yvonne and Ludwig. Thank you very much for it. I was just wondering if in 1911 there is a very famous movie, film, about the hell in Inferno, and it's all tableau vivant of Gustave Doré. And so I was wondering if you have seen any connection and if you know about perhaps like a mixing between still images and animated pictures in the show, or if it was not at all in the newspapers, in the reviews. So have you any connection with this? Or?
So a question about a 1911 film about the Hell Inferno and Gustave Doré, and whether in Hoffmann's shows there were also animated images.
No, there were only lantern effects, like dissolving views, and nothing moving this way. It was based on this kind of magnificent tableau. And so the only funny thing is that they made their own Doré images for Purgatorio and Paradiso.
Maybe I could just thank you, Valentin, because maybe it is it has a connection between Pesendorfer's recollection of Dante and the film that was out. So that could be possible. So it would be interesting that came from there. So, yeah.
I have a question for Daniel. It's about geography. You indicated with the trajectories that there's a lot of traffic in and around Barcelona. There was a lot of frequency of lecturers going there. Do you have an explanation why explicitly in that area of Spain there was so much traffic, so to say?
Yeah, it's about if maybe yeah, I can think. I think yeah, that's in my maps there were a lot of traffic in Catalonia and around Barcelona, and if I have an explanation, there could be two explanations. One, that there are blind spots in my sources, as I indicated. I did not find, and even in the Basque Country in physical collections, I could not find in a first research newspapers of this period. So I don't really know. Of course, Catalonia is an economic important part of the peninsula, and it's close to the border, so this could be explanation. But I really don't know. I think we can assume that he did this in other places as well, maybe. And also he did more touring in Catalonia in his third visit. So maybe it's a way to extract more and more, to cover more places when he knows better the place. But again, all our assumptions.
This isn't quite a direct answer to that question, but this is a slightly shameless plug for a project that's just been funded by the Portuguese Research Council on looking at the Cosmorama in Iberia, precisely looking at circuits of exhibition across both Spain and Portugal, with some transnational links to both to the UK as well. I'm just a kind of a very peripheral kind of part of the project, but that time kind of mapping around Barcelona, kind of Madrid, Lisbon and Porto is going to kind of, for at least the Cosmorama, is going to take place over the next kind of 18 months or 2 years.
I'm not really having a question, but rather a remark about Hoffmann's series on geology. We talked about that yesterday shortly. I work at Titus Museum. We have a dissolving Q apparatus made by Grosse in Hamburg, including slides, and I did some research on them. We acquired it in 1860. We're pretty, well, we acquired it and used it in 1860. Now that's also a comment on the first question, or an addition. We do have lecture notes. They are fragmentary, very unorganized, but it was the machine was acquired and used by one of my predecessors. It's very interesting because he uses them in the winter lectures of late 1860, early 1861, so precisely dated. And the first use, he explains, he refers to the dissolving tube shows in Europe. He doesn't mention Hoffmann though. So he refers to the scientifically correct, I think, institutions like the Polytechnical Institution in London. So, but not to the showman of Hoffmann. Actually, he never refers to Hoffmann. So when you talk about networks, it's really interesting. We acquired an apparatus and a show that was very much up to date, I think, a novelty. He presented it as a novelty. He used the slides in his own sequences. So he reshaped, I think, maybe the story told by Hoffmann. Not sure about that. And I just wanted to share that with you because by now I think, well, it's quite early and in some way very well documented as well. So,
Yes. Yes, I think this is very interesting, and I cannot imagine that the people in Haarlem did know anything about Hoffmann. Because when we thought about this change of dispositive, when Hoffmann came from his early demonstration, astronomical demonstration objects, he was a clockmaker, and he was the son of a clockmaker. And they had an own workshop. And so that was his way into the Volksbildung, people's education. And when he has obviously changed to the art of projection, he was able to build his own apparatus. But I think he was looking in the market for the best slides. And I think the Grosse slides at this time were the best. And so it is wonderful to bring these things together. But I cannot imagine that when Hoffmann started in 1857, that anybody has seen him as something important. And later on, he was able to produce his own slides and things like that. But at this time, he was the early adopter of an existing medium. Yeah.
They probably the entrance. But then somehow it got disconnected from Hoffmann. Or Hoffmann was not a producer of the slides. I thought that, and we discussed that yesterday. But only one of the buyers. And so Van Breda, my predecessor, was one of the early buyers as well.
Yeah, yeah.
It's really very fascinating.
This is interesting. Hoffmann was a buyer and the museum was a buyer.
Probably. So, yeah, sheds a new light on my collection. So thank you. There is more to find, you know, and archives.
So thanks for this wonderful panel, a really, really great panel. And what's kind of come clear to me is that this was really this mid to late 19th century moment was really the era of the generalist and the popularizer. And I'm just wondering, it kind of just kept thinking about this portmanteau that was so popular a while ago, you know, edutainment. And I just was wondering, because there seems to be quite a spectrum about, you know, some people are kind of promoting the effects that they're showing more than the topics, and vice versa, fresh stuff. And I was just wondering if you could just weigh in briefly on kind of your sense of edutainment during, you know, vis-a-vis your research.
So the sense of edutainment in the middle decades of the 19th century and the balance of entertainment, spectacularity and education.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's the idea of edutainment is a really good kind of portmanteau word for someone like Malden's lectures, in that you've got, just within the structure of the lecture itself, you've got a mixture of entertaining slides, chromatropes, but also you've got the information being conveyed by Molden through the lecture, and it's probably a mixture of history, geography, natural history, kind of a travelogue. You've got all of those different areas and discipline. They're all kind of rolled together, so it just works as a package, you know. And the idea is to make it as broad-based in its appeal as possible. You're trying to get bums on seats as well. I mean, these are commercial propositions. You're trying to make your appeal as broad and as wide-ranging as possible. So edutainment works well for that.
I think Hoffmann always remained with people's education. He never was in the situation that he had to do only entertainment to get his money. But there is, I think, another reason, because all the time he lived, he sold his tellurians. That was another part of his business. So the workshop at home still produced tellurians, and they sold it to schools and whatever. Or he has a deal that he gave to a certain school in a town a tellurian, and for this he got the theater. So, but he wanted to make it entertaining, but he never went directly only into entertainment.
Okay.
Yeah, so also kind of like a comment and question for everybody. First of all, thank you for this outstanding panel, which three really well researched and prepared presentations that like resonated with each other very well. I think that there's sort of like a question that I would like to hear from you. Also to hear whether you see this as an issue at all. Is that so when we do research on these 19th century popular spectacles, at least the way I do it, I very often encounter this problem of actually their nomenclature. So the way how these show people actually appropriate titles for their shows, they appropriate names from other media and sort of like start using those about these things. I guess that maybe this is most sort of like relevant for Daniel's research, especially because you this kind of an archival database-based research. So I think that I encounter often shows about which I'm uncertain what is actually their sort of like nature. So when you talk about dissolving views or dioramic effects or even more complicated sort of like things. So I was just kind of curious to see, I mean, that is this an issue for somehow for all of you, this problem of identification, so which is related with the limited nature of much of the source material that we find. So we find newspaper and also the way how they show people very often like to blow up, you know, like offer their things with certain types of words and discursive figures and things like that. And if I may add like a very, very brief direct question for John, is that, John, based on your research on Malden, can we conclude that Malden is the real inventor of the triple lantern or the triennial lantern?
I can see Richard saying no, so I'm going with whatever Richard says. Kind of. Just to the other part of the question about archives and nomenclature. So I think at the very introduction today, we were talking about the paradigm of technological determinism. And I think it is the case, on one hand, we can say, well, this is what a dissolving view is, but that's not necessarily how a showman or a lecturer is always using the idea of a dissolving view. So with Molden, it's dioramic. You know, Molden's using dioramic to describe his large lantern projections, but they're not the diorama in terms of the Daguerrean invention of the diorama. But what's interesting is that he's using dioramic to position himself in the marketplace of shows, and he wants to distinguish himself from the run-of-the-mill lantern lecturer. So this is not your common or garden lantern lecture. It's something better, it's something bigger, it's something more spectacular. So it can be a problem in terms of search words and keywords and the way in which you then go about that and trying to work out what it is. But it also can be really revealing about how these showmen or lecturers are positioning themselves and what sort of markets that they're aiming at, or how they're trying to distinguish themselves or differentiate themselves. So, yeah.
I think Paul Hoffmann, when you look at his own advertisements, first of all, he highlights what is it about. Dantes Göttliche Komödie or Die Nibelungen, and he calls it Grosse Vorstellung. So great show. And one piece of technology that very often appears, or all the time appears, is der stärkste hydrooxygene Gasapparat. The strongest hydrooxygenic gas apparatus. This is an amazing kind of adverting things, but it obviously worked. In articles, he used dissolving views in English and Nebelbilder. But it was, it's amazing in difference to Molden that these aspects of the effects were not so important for him, obviously, in his advertisements.
Yeah, the question of the terminology, of course, is a very important one and very difficult doing research. And also, as I think we all agree, it's also representative or tell us something also about this, about being like kind of a media that englobes all the media. The fact that it can be confused with other kind of shows, and that's what I was there, but that's what I will try to say with this technical approach or more optical media approach that will be more interesting. And in my case, I try to cover different news and then cross information and try to ascribe the technique to a show. And sometimes also this is something that with some of the books I show you, with the books in Madrid, I will disagree with how some shows are ascribed to a particular technique. And that is also maybe that it will be interesting to try to write these histories, or at least try to, in more chronological order and not in a technical chapters, because this produces, I think, this sense of gaps. Because when I go to these local histories, I start with the chapter of the lantern, and that, of course, is a mistake, because there are many shows going in parallel. And also the question of identification, yeah, it's very interesting, and even I have questions myself, like, for instance, the fact that there are chromatropes in the programs indicates, I mean, chromatropes is maybe a word with a high percentage associated to just lantern. I mean, it's something that I would like to ask you even. So yeah, so I would say it's very difficult. And also I would say that it is difficult. It's already something that we learn, and that maybe we are, as I understand that all of you will agree, we are projecting to that. And also even, I think at least in Spain, sometimes it's that from today they are saying that they were mistaken, that they used the wrong word. But of course, I think it's more interesting to see it the other time. It's us who are trying to understand how they talk. So they cannot talk, they cannot be mistaken. It's us who are mistaken.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've reached the end of our time. Take your questions to the coffee break, and we meet again at 11:15.